There is a promise sold across the internet in glossy fonts and Ancestry advertisements. Type in your surname, and DNA will tell you if a samurai's blood runs through you. It sounds simple. It sounds provable. And that is exactly where the story starts to fall apart, because the science behind Japanese surnames and ancestry is far stranger, older, and more layered than any bloodline test can capture. For generations, the assumption seemed reasonable enough. Certain Japanese surnames, Sato, Suzuki, Takahashi, Tanaka, Watanabe, Ito, and dozens of others, sound aristocratic, martial, rooted in the world of castles and clans. Popular imagination linked many of these names directly to samurai households, to warrior lineages that supposedly carried their honor, their loyalty, and their blood intact from the age of the shogunate into the present day. If your name matched a known samurai clan, the logic went, some trace of that ancestry must still be sitting quietly in your genome, waiting to be found. It is a compelling story. It is also, according to the actual history and genetics of Japan, almost certainly too simple. To understand why, you first have to understand what a Japanese surname actually was, and when it actually appeared. For most of Japanese history, surnames were not a universal feature of identity. They belonged almost exclusively to the aristocracy and the samurai class, a formal marker of status and lineage that ordinary farmers, merchants, and laborers were largely forbidden from using in official records. Then, in 1870, everything changed at once. As Japan rapidly modernized under the Meiji government, a new law required every citizen, regardless of class, to register a permanent surname. Millions of families who had never legally held one suddenly needed to choose. Some picked names tied to their village, their trade, their geography, or a nearby landmark. Others adopted names that simply sounded dignified, respectable, or, in some cases, deliberately similar to the aristocratic and samurai names they admired. This is the first crack in the popular story, and it is a significant one. A large number of the very surnames now associated in the popular imagination with samurai heritage were not necessarily inherited from actual samurai households at all. They were chosen, sometimes borrowed, sometimes invented, by families with no documented connection to the warrior class, in the span of a single generation less than 200 years ago. That does not mean every samurai-sounding surname is disconnected from its supposed origin. Some genuinely do trace to real warrior households with documented lineage records stretching back centuries. But it means a surname alone, on its own, cannot function as reliable proof of ancestry. The name and the blood do not automatically travel together. And once historians recognized that gap, the question shifted from, which names are samurai names, to something far more interesting. What does the DNA of people carrying these names actually show, once you look past the name itself? This is where genetics entered the conversation, and where the story stopped being about surnames at all, and became something much larger, the deep ancestral structure of the Japanese population itself. Modern population geneticists studying Japan have focused heavily on what is often called the dual structure model. The idea that the ancestors of modern Japanese people descend from two major ancestral populations that met and mixed over thousands of years. The first is the Jomon, hunter-gatherer populations who inhabited the Japanese archipelago for thousands of years going back into the deep prehistoric past. The second is the Yayoi, rice-farming migrants who began arriving from the Asian mainland roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, bringing agriculture, metalworking, and, eventually, new genetic ancestry that mixed with the existing Jomon population. Researchers have used a combination of tools to trace this. Y chromosome DNA, passed largely unchanged from father to son, mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, and increasingly, whole genome sequencing that captures ancestry from every branch of the family tree at once. Each of these tools tells a slightly different part of the story, and that is exactly where the picture gets complicated. Because the DNA did not simply confirm a clean split between old island population and mainland newcomers. It revealed something messy. Modern Japanese genomes carry Jomon and Yayoi ancestry in wildly different proportions depending on region. Populations in Okinawa and parts of the northern Tohoku region and Hokkaido, home to the indigenous Ainu, tend to carry a notably higher proportion of Jamin ancestry than populations in the more densely settled Kansai and Kanto regions, where Yayoi-descended ancestry runs deeper. That regional pattern does not map neatly onto any surname at all. Isato in Aomori and Isato in Osaka may carry meaningfully different ancestral balances, despite sharing an identical name. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal, one suggesting that surname and deep ancestry are, in this population, two almost entirely separate stories running in parallel. If you find this kind of layered, evidence-driven history compelling, it's worth sticking around, because Japan's genetic record turns out to hide even more surprising complexity the deeper researchers look. The conflict deepens further once you bring the samurai class itself into focus, because the samurai were never a genetically distinct or isolated population to begin with. Samurai status was fundamentally a social and legal category, not a biological one. Men could be promoted into samurai rank through military service, and daimyo occasionally elevated loyal retainers or even skilled commoners into the samurai class for their service. Samurai households also frequently married into merchant and farming families for political or economic alliances, particularly during the long peace of the Edo period, when strict class boundaries softened considerably in practice even as they remained rigid on paper. A samurai lineage, followed back far enough, does not lead to a genetically sealed warrior bloodline. It leads into the same broad ancestral pool as everyone else in the region, farmers, artisans, and rice cultivators included. At this point, researchers working on Japanese ancestry and surname history generally point to a few overlapping explanations for why the popular samurai surname equals samurai DNA idea breaks down so consistently. The first is simple demographic reality. Samurai made up a relatively small percentage of Japan's population, roughly 5 to 10% by most historical estimates, meaning the majority of people alive in Japan today, regardless of surname, descend overwhelmingly from the much larger farming and merchant classes. The second is the 1870 surname adoption event itself, a single administrative moment where surname choice and biological ancestry were, for millions of families, disconnected in one generational stroke, as commoners freely selected names with no requirement of proven lineage. The third is the sheer depth of regional admixture across the Jamin-Yayoi spectrum, layered on top of centuries of internal migration between provinces, meaning that even families with genuinely documented samurai ancestry carry a genome shaped by far more than one warrior ancestor a dozen or more generations back, diluted, mixed, and folded into a much wider ancestral pattern with every passing generation. The most significant recent evidence comes from expanded whole genome studies that moved beyond small regional samples and began comparing modern Japanese populations against a broader panel that includes ancient DNA extracted from Jamin period skeletal remains alongside comparative data from mainland East Asian populations. This matters because ancient DNA lets researchers compare living people directly against the actual hunter-gatherers who lived on the archipelago thousands of years before any samurai class existed. What these broader studies found was that Jamin ancestry, once assumed by some earlier researchers to be a minor, largely diluted contribution, actually persists at meaningfully higher levels across the modern population than earlier smaller studies suggested, and that this ancestry is distributed unevenly in ways that trace geography and ancient settlement patterns far more closely than they trace any surname or social class. Here is the twist worth sitting with. The DNA does not deliver what the marketing promises. It does not sort Japanese families into samurai and non-samurai genetic categories, because no such clean category ever existed in the biology to begin with. What the genome actually preserves instead is older and, in its own way, more remarkable, a deep signature of the original island hunter-gatherer population, layered underneath thousands of years of mainland migration, regional isolation, and internal mixing that has nothing to do with warrior status at all. Not a samurai bloodline. A far older story, written by geography and time rather than by rank. This matters beyond genealogy hobbyists chasing a flattering ancestry story. It is a reminder that human population history rarely respects the categories we build on top of it. Social class, legal status, and cultural prestige are recent inventions layered over populations that were already ancient, already mixed, already shaped by tens of thousands of years of movement and adaptation long before anyone carried a sword or a title. The genome does not know what a samurai was. It only knows who mixed with whom, generation after generation, going back to the first people who crossed onto those islands. Picture the landscape underneath all of this. Misted volcanic ridgelines running down the spine of Honshu, where rice terraces have been cut into hillsides for over 2,000 years. Cedar forests in the northern mountains where Jamin communities once built their pit dwellings, watching the seasons turn for millennia before anyone spoke of clans or castles. Coastal fishing villages in Kyushu, closest to the mainland, where the first yayoi rice farmers likely made landfall, carrying with them not just seed grain but the beginning of a new genetic thread that would eventually spread the length of the archipelago. The land does not remember samurai armor. It remembers footpaths worn by farmers, fishermen, and migrants moving quietly across centuries, leaving behind a signature far deeper than any name. Scientists remain genuinely cautious about how far to take any of this. The evidence does not prove that no modern family descends from documented samurai ancestors. Many genuinely do, supported by real genealogical records rather than genetic guesswork. What the data complicates is the far bigger, far more marketable claim that a surname alone can function as a genetic passport into warrior ancestry. The honest picture is less cinematic and, in its own way, more moving. Nearly everyone carrying one of these 14 surnames is, in some measure, descended from the same deep well of ancestry, Jamin hunter-gatherers and yayoi farmers, mixing across thousands of years, long before anyone needed a name to prove who they were. The old story wanted a clean answer. A name, a class, a bloodline, confirmed. What the genome offers instead is something the marketing never advertises. Proof that everyone carrying these names is connected to a far older, far more universal Japanese story than any single samurai household could ever contain. The mystery was never who the true samurai descendants are. It was how much deeper, older, and more shared this ancestry turns out to be than any name on a family register could ever suggest. If stories like this change the way you think about your own name, that curiosity is worth following, because in nearly every population on Earth, the true history hiding in our DNA is stranger, older, and far more connected than the labels we inherited ever let on.